The year is 9946. The sun has just risen for the last time in 2 years. You don't know it yet, but in a few hours a mountain in Asia will explode with the force of 10,000 Hiroshima bombs. The blast will be heard 2,000 kilometers away. 100 billion tons of ash will cover the sky. Global temperatures will drop by 3 degrees C. Crops will fail from China to Japan. 1 in 3 East Asians will die of hunger or cold. Kings will lose their thrones. Gods will be abandoned. And most terrifying of all, for 946 consecutive days the sun will rise, but you won't be able to see it. This is the true story of the day the world almost ended, and no one told you about it. But to understand how a single mountain destroyed an entire continent, you must first understand the world that existed before it exploded. A world that in many ways was at the height of its prosperity. The year 946 began like any other in living memory. In China, the rooster crowed at 4 a.m. in the villages along the Yellow River. Peasants woke up, looked at the clear sky, and gave thanks for another day of sunshine for their rice fields. No one imagined that within a few months they would be eating tree bark to survive. China in 946 was a fragmented giant. In the north, the Liao dynasty of the Khitan controlled vast territories with an iron fist. In the south, the chaos of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms created a mosaic of petty warlords, each vying to be the true heir to the heavenly mandate. It was a golden age for opportunists and hell for the peasants, who paid taxes to whoever controlled their village that month. But there was prosperity in this chaos. The markets of Kaifeng produced silk that would reach as far as Baghdad. Tea from the south traveled up the rivers on never-stopping boats. Furnaces produced iron day and night. The population grew because, despite local wars, harvests were predictable. Rain in spring, sun in summer, harvest in autumn. The cycle never failed until it failed. Crossing the Yellow Sea, the kingdom of Goryeo was experiencing its moment of consolidation. King Jongjong had just ascended the throne, determined to unify the Korean peninsula under a single banner. Buddhist monasteries flourished in the mountains. Artisans produced celadon pottery, the likes of which the world had never seen. And at the spiritual center of it all was Mount Paektu, the sacred mountain, where, according to legend, the mythical founder of the Korean nation had descended from heaven. Paektu was not just a mountain. It was a sleeping god. Its perfectly circular crater lake reflected the sky like a divine mirror. Pilgrims climbed its slopes to drink sacred water. Shamans performed rituals in its forests. No one suspected that beneath this placid lake, 5 kilometers deep, a magma chamber the size of a city pulsed, waiting. Further east, Rayon, Japan was experiencing what historians would later call its golden age. In Kyoto, the imperial court was a world apart. Ladies wrote poetry about the ephemeral beauty of cherry blossoms. Monks copied sutras in temples that smelled of incense and ancient wood. Samurai, not quite samurai yet, were aristocratic warriors. They trained with bows in perfect gardens. Japanese life in 946 revolved around rice. It wasn't just food. It was currency, status, power. A prosperous rice field meant taxes paid, daughters with good dowries, sons educated in temples. The entire calendar was organized around planting and harvesting. Shinto festivals thanked Amaterasu, the sun goddess, for the light that made the rice grow. Within a few months, the sun would be their greatest enemy. In the northern steppes, Mongols and other nomadic tribes followed herds across endless pastures. They didn't build cities or plant grain. Their world was the horse, the bow, and the open sky. When the grass was green, life was good. When it dried, they migrated. Simple as that. This system had worked for 1,000 years. But what happens when all the grass dies at once? When snow covers the steppes in the middle of summer? When 10,000 horses die in a week? They would soon find out. Trade connected all these worlds. Silk Road caravans crossed deserts carrying Chinese jade to the west, Syrian glass to the east. Korean ships carried ginseng to Chinese ports. Buddhist monks traveled between monasteries carrying sacred texts and unknowingly connecting destinies. In 1960, East Asia had 100 million inhabitants. 1 in 4 humans alive on the planet was there. In that corner of the world, living, loving, working, completely unaware that beneath a sacred mountain, forces they didn't understand were about to rewrite their destiny. The last normal summer began as always. Peasants planted, merchants traveled, kings ruled, monks prayed. The sun rose bright and golden over green fields. The rains came on time. The first ears of rice began to form. promising another year of abundance. Then one random September morning, a fisherman on Mount Paektu lake noticed something strange. The water, always crystal clear and cold, was lukewarm. Bubbles rose from the bottom. Dead fish floated on the surface. He rowed back to shore, disturbed. It was the first sign. The earth was about to open its throat and scream. But the earth doesn't scream without warning. It whispers first. And on Mount Paektu it had been whispering for weeks. The deer descended from the upper slopes in August, a month earlier than usual. Bears abandoned dens their families had used for generations. Entire flocks of birds flew south and didn't return. Local shamans interpreted it as a bad omen and performed appeasement rituals. They sacrificed a white bull to the spirit of the mountain. The blood had barely touched the sacred ground when the first real earthquake struck. September 10th, year 946, 3 a.m. The tremor woke villages within a 300-kilometer radius. It wasn't the gentle sway they knew, it was a violent jolt, as if the mountain itself had punched the earth. Barns collapsed, temples cracked. The lake at the top of the mountain shook so much that 3-meter waves crashed against the shore. Then silence, a silence worse than the tremor. For 12 hours, nothing. The villagers left their homes, assessed the damage, and began repairs. Some of the more cautious grabbed what they could carry and fled. Most stayed where they would go. This was their land, their world. The sacred mountain would never truly harm them. On the 10th, 3 p.m., the lake began to boil. It wasn't ordinary steam. It was a violent bubbling boil, as if 1,000 fires were burning beneath the water. The lake, which had always been crystal blue, turned gray, then yellow, then blood red. The smell of rotten eggs and sulfur drifted down the mountain like a poisonous mist. Birds fell dead in mid-flight. Fish rose to the surface by the thousands, already cooked. A monk who survived and recorded the event wrote, "The spirit of the mountain woke up hungry. We can hear its stomach rumbling beneath our feet. Day 10, midnight. The pressure beneath the mountain reached the point of no return. 5 kilometers below the surface, a magma chamber that had been building pressure for centuries found a weakness in the rock. Imagine a balloon inflating for 1,000 years and finally bursting. But this balloon contained 100 billion tons of molten rock at 1,000 degrees C. Day 11, 5:42 a.m., time Z0. The explosion was heard in Beijing, 1,000 kilometers away. In Kyoto, 1,500 kilometers away, monks recorded a thunderclap that came from the earth, not the sky. But for those nearby, there was no sound. The shock wave shattered eardrums instantly. The mountain didn't explode upward, it shot upward. A column of pulverized rock ash and gas rose 45 kilometers into the air, piercing the troposphere, piercing the stratosphere. Within 6 minutes, the top of the column was higher than any cloud could reach. Within 10 minutes, it began to spread laterally, forming what distant witnesses described as a black mushroom that ate the sky. But the real horror lay at the base. Pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gas and molten rock rushed down the slopes at 700 kilometers H. Temperatures reached 800 degrees C. Everything within a 60-kilometer radius simply ceased to exist. It didn't burn, it vaporized. A village of 3,000 people was harvesting their morning harvest. Within 45 seconds, there was no village, no bodies, nothing. Just a 10-meter deep layer of ash where life used to be. The Srua River, one of the largest in the region, evaporated. It didn't dry up, it evaporated. Fishermen downstream saw a wall of steam rising, followed by a wave of boiling mud, filled with charred trees and what appeared to be black statues, bodies instantly petrified by the heat. The first 24 hours were physical hell, but it was only the beginning. The rain began at noon, but it wasn't water, it was mud. Volcanic ash, mixed with condensed steam, fell like liquid concrete. Each drop weighed like a stone. Roofs collapsed under the weight. People running for cover were buried alive as their houses gave way. The ash continued to fall, first as gray snow, then as black hail. Finally, stones the size of fists, 500 kilometers away in Pyongyang. Day turned to night at 2 p.m. Not twilight, but total darkness. People lit torches to see their own hands. A Chinese merchant on the road to Shenyang wrote, "The sun died in the middle of the day. We thought the world had ended." Many knelt and confessed their sins, awaiting the final judgment. But the sun had not died. He had been murdered. And his killer was a cloud of 100 billion tons of ash and sulfur oxide that now circled the globe at a height of 15 kilometers, where no rain could wash it away. By the end of the first day, Mount Paektu had lost 1,000 meters in height. Where once there was a sacred peak, there was now a crater 5 kilometers in diameter. The sacred lake evaporated. The ancient forest ash, the temples, the shrines, the villages, the people, as if they had never existed. But that was only the immediate physical trauma. The true apocalypse was just beginning, because that black cloud that now covered the sky would not go away. Not for days, not for weeks. For 2.5 years, the sun would be but a pale memory behind a veil of ash. And when there is no sun, there is no heat. When there is no heat, there is no harvest. When there is no harvest, there is only one certainty: death. And death arrives slowly, dressed in cold. Not the winter cold they knew, but a misguided alien cold that arrived in September, when it should have been warm. A cold that turned the rain into icy needles and made the rice fields die while still green. On the 20th, after the eruption, the ash veil had spread across East Asia. In Luoyang, 1,000 kilometers to the south, an imperial astronomer noted, "The sun has risen, but we cannot see it. Only a pale circle, like the moon through the mist. It does not warm, it does not illuminate, it is a dead sun." He was right. The sunlight reaching the surface had dropped by 70%. Imagine wearing sunglasses all day, every day. But sunglasses that also block heat. Photosynthesis, that silent miracle that powers the world, simply stopped working. October 946, the first deadly frost. Normally, the October frost was mild, preparing the fields for winter. This time it came like a hammer, -5 degrees on a night that should have been 10 degrees Celsius. Peasants woke to find their rice fields 2 weeks from harvest, completely black, frozen and dead. A farmer in Shandong tried to save his crop, lighting fires between the rice rows, covering the shoots with straw, and praying to every god he knew. In the morning, he found only broken stalks covered in black ice. His 8-year-old son asked, "Dad, what are we going to eat in the winter?" He got no answer. The numbers were apocalyptic. China produced 30 million tons of grain a year. In 947, it produced 9 million. To feed 60 million people, it needed at least 25 million. The math was simple and deadly. 30 million people would have nothing to eat. November 946. Snow that shouldn't exist. Snow in November in northern China was normal. Snow 2 meters deep wasn't. Snow in Canton, in the subtropical deep south, was impossible. Until it happened. Palm trees froze. Bamboo shattered like glass. Tropical birds fell dead from the trees. In Korea, the Han River froze solid in November. Normally, this happened in January and only partially. Now carts were crossing where boats should have sailed. The ice was 1 meter thick, and a strange gray color from the volcanic ash mixed in. But the worst was happening in the rice fields of Japan. Japanese rice was an art. Generations perfecting every technique, every timing, every ritual. All useless. Now a monk in Nara wrote, "The fields look like cemeteries, rows and rows of organized death. The peasants no longer weep, they just stare." December 946, the impossible winter. The average temperature dropped 3.5 degrees C globally. It seems small. In the last ice age, the temperature was only 5 degrees so colder than normal. 3.5 degrees C was enough to transform the world into an unrecognizable place. Lakes that never froze became ice rings. The Yellow Sea between China and Korea froze up to 15 kilometers from the coast. Fishermen walked where they had once sailed, looking for holes in the ice to fish. Many found nothing. The fish had died or fled to deep water. The snow did not melt. Each storm added more layers. In some mountainous areas, entire villages were buried. They would find the bodies of the dead only years later, when the thaw finally arrived. January 1947, the Great Famine migration began as a trickle, isolated families abandoning dead farms. Then it became a river. Thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people moving south, seeking warmth that no one had, food no one had. The roads, already precarious, became rivers of frozen mud and ash. Bare feet left trails of blood in the snow. Children were carried until they could be carried no longer. Then they were left. But they sang lullabies to babies who had already stopped breathing, unable to accept reality. An official in Renan reported, "They see from the north like a dark wave, 10,000 today, perhaps 20,000 tomorrow. We have no food even for ourselves. What can I offer but empty words?" February 947, the collapse of prices and order. The price of rice increased 1,000% in 4 months. Then it ceased to have a price. No one sold for money, only barter. A sack of rice for a daughter, A handful of millet for iron tools, a bowl of porridge for anything that could burn for fire. Markets that had functioned for centuries closed. Milestone trade routes were abandoned. Money turned to worthless paper. The social fabric built over 1,000 years unraveled in months. March 1947, still winter, always winter. Spring didn't come. March arrived and the snow continued to fall. Farmers who still had seeds couldn't plant. The ground was frozen half a meter deep. Even if they managed to plant, there was no sunlight to make them grow. Desperation spawned mad attempts. Some tried planting pots indoors near the fire. Others dug underground greenhouses. An inventor in Kaifeng created bronze mirrors to concentrate what little light there was. Nothing worked. You can't fool photosynthesis. Summer 947, the summer that never was. Julius arrived with October temperatures. August was colder than a normal March. The autumn harvest, the last hope, died before birth for the first time in 1,000 years. The eternal cycle of planting and harvesting was completely broken. In the northern passes, the disaster was different, but equally total. The grass didn't grow. It was that simple. Without grass, the cattle died. Without cattle, the nomads died. Entire tribes disappeared. They left only horse bones in endless white fields. The final figures for the volcanic winter are disputed by historians, but the most conservative are terrifying. Average temperatures were 3.5 degrees below normal for 18 months. Snowfall was 400% above normal. Hours of direct sunlight less than 2 per day. Agricultural production 30% of normal. The population that survived the first year, perhaps 70%, and there was still a year and a half of darkness to come. A Persian merchant who traversed the Silk Road in 947 left the most frightening account. I traveled through cities that seemed alive from afar. Smoke rose from chimneys. Footprints marked the snow. But upon entering, there was only silence. People sat in their homes, frozen in prayer. Entire cities mummified by the cold. The volcanic winter didn't kill, it preserved. It was a museum of the apocalypse. But the living didn't have the luxury of becoming ice statues. They had to keep living, even when living meant doing things that months before would have been unthinkable. This is the part of the story that official records tried to hide. But famine has its own memory, etched in bones and whispered in deathbed confessions. Zhang was a respectable farmer in A. He had 3 sons, a wife, and 2 water buffaloes. By September 946, he was considered prosperous. In March 947, he ate his last water buffalo. In May, his wife fled with her 2 eldest sons, leaving only the youngest, aged 5. "I can't watch them all die," she said. Zhang never saw her again. With the boy crying with hunger, Zhang did the unthinkable. First, leather soup. She boiled his sandals, his belt, the reins of the dead buffalo. Leather swells in water, fooling the stomach for a few hours, but leather doesn't nourish. Then came tree bark. Pine was the best, less bitter. She ground it to powder, mixed it with water and the last handful of flour. The boy vomited half of it, but half remained. June 1947. Famine recipes circulated like dark secrets. Grass tea, any green plant boiled until soft. Many were poisonous. Entire families died testing what was edible. Earth bread, white clay mixed with flour. It filled the stomach but destroyed the intestines. Children died with swollen bellies full of mud. Bone gruel, old bones ground to powder, boiled for days. Calcium gave illusion of nourishment. A Taoist monk documented 47 different foods of despair. They included paper, cloth, and cane rope, to name but said only, "When hunger eats the soul, the unspeakable becomes inevitable." July 947, the unspeakable. The first cases were denied, then hidden. Then, when they became impossible to hide, justified. In Shanxi province, an official vaguely reported, "Animals against nature were committed." Hunger turned men into demons. The truth was worse. In villages isolated by eternal winter, when the last grain was gone, when the last root was dug up, when the last hide was boiled, only 2 choices remained. Die or the records are fragmentary, shameful, but they exist. A magistrate in Renan wrote in code, "The night market sells nameless meat. Do not ask its origin." A Buddhist monk was more direct in his private diary. "I saw the unavoidable. A mother, her children, the impossible choice. Buddha abandoned us, or we abandoned Buddha. It began with the dead, frozen bodies preserved by the cold. They're gone," they rationalized. "They're just flesh now." But the line once crossed, is hard to re-establish. Soon the weak disappeared. The sick disappeared. Children were sent to fetch firewood and never returned. September 947, the collapse of humanity. In some regions, survival pacts were formed, groups that agreed that when someone died, they would feed the others. Documents sealed in blood, oaths that no subsequent dynasty wanted to preserve. But there are forgotten archives, testimonies of human darkness. An intercepted letter read, "Uncle, don't come visit us here. We are no longer human. We saved you from this curse by staying away." But not everyone succumbed to the darkness. Amid the horror, acts of impossible kindness shone like stars on a moonless night. The White Cloud Temple in Zandong opened its doors to 3,000 refugees. The monks knew there wasn't enough food for everyone. They decided the monks would fast, the refugees would eat. In 90 days, 400 monks voluntarily starved to death. Their bodies were cremated, and the ashes mixed with the soil, so that when the sun returns, we will be part of the next harvest. Sangoryo, an old woman known only as Grandmother Maun, kept 30 orphans alive throughout the winter. How did she go out every night and return with food? No one asked where from. When they found her dead in the spring of 948, they discovered bite marks on her own arms. She had been eating little by little to feed the children. The most extraordinary thing was the chains of sacrifice. The same pattern was documented in several villages. The old men stopped eating first, unable to digest well anyway. Then the adult men. Women had to survive to care for the children. Then the women. In the end, only children survived, fed by the chain of sacrifices spanning 3 generations. October 947. The innovations of desperation. Necessity created unlikely inventors. A blacksmith in Kaifeng discovered that certain mosses grew without light, fed by decaying matter. He created moss farms in basements. It wasn't nutritious, but it filled stomachs. Japanese fishermen learned to drill holes in the ice and fish at depths never before attempted. They discovered schools of fish they hadn't even known existed. Blind fish adapted to perpetual darkness. Koreans developed elaborate traps for rats and other rodents. 1 rat fed a person for a day. Their family needed 5 rats. The mathematics of survival. But the most important innovation was social. Villages that had competed for generations banded together. Distribution systems ensured everyone received something, even if it was next to nothing. Individual hunger became collective hunger, and this paradoxically saved more lives. December 947. A year and a half after the eruption, the first change was subtle. The sun, still pale, became a little less pale. The temperature rose half a degree. The snow fell a little less. For most, imperceptible. But for those who counted every degree, every ray of light, it was the first hope in 18 months. An anonymous diary captures the moment. Today the ice leaked. Just 3 drops, but it leaked. I cried. I don't remember the last time I cried. Perhaps there are no more tears, but the ice leaked. The survivors began to emerge from their hiding places, from their shame, from their dark pacts. Thin as skeletons, sunken eyes, some mad, some mute with trauma, but alive. Estimates vary, but the historical consensus is terrifying. 30 to 40 million dead. 1 in 3 inhabitants of East Asia. Entire dynasties of agricultural knowledge lost. Languages extinct because all the speakers died, and the survivors carried secrets they would take to the grave. What they did, what they ate, what they sacrificed, who they sacrificed. But they also carried something more. Proof that even when the sun dies, even when the world freezes, even when hunger eats away at the soul, some humans find the strength to carry on. Not heroes, not saints, just survivors, doing the unthinkable to see another dawn, even if that dawn is but a pale promise behind a veil of ash. And when they finally looked up from that nightmare of survival, they looked for someone to blame, or someone to save their souls from what they had done to survive. The gods, the kings, the priests, they had all failed. Now, they would have to explain why. In the Chinese imperial court, panic was palpable. The mandate of heaven, that ancient belief that the emperor ruled with divine approval, was in tatters. If natural disasters meant heaven withdrawing its support, what did the greatest disaster in 1,000 years mean? Emperor Tu of the later Yan dynasty summoned his astrologers. Interpret the signs, he ordered. They consulted ancient texts, celestial maps, oracle bones. The answer was unanimous and terrifying. The heavens are out of balance. The throne lost its virtue. It was a political death sentence. Within 3 months, revolts in 7 provinces. Generals proclaimed new mandates. The empire, already fragmented, shattered even further. The later Jin dynasty would fall completely in 7, replaced by the later Han. The volcano had done in months what armies could not achieve in years, but the emperor tried. He opened the imperial granaries, what little remained. He ordered public fasts to share the people's suffering. He cancelled construction projects. He released prisoners. He even performed the ultimate ritual of humiliation. He walked barefoot in the snow to the temple in heaven and prostrated himself for 3 days, begging forgiveness for sins he didn't even know he had committed. It didn't work. How could it? The people didn't want symbolism. They wanted food. In Goryeo, Mount Paektu presented a unique theological problem. The mountain that exploded was no ordinary mountain. It was the mythical birthplace of the nation, where Dangun, the legendary founder, had descended from heaven. If the sacred mountain had turned against them, what did that mean? King Jongjong ordered the largest ritual in Korean history. 3,000 Buddhist monks were summoned, 100 white bulls sacrificed, and mountains of incense burned. For 49 days, gongs sounded non-stop in every temple. The goal was to purify national karma. The monks created an elaborate explanation. The mountain wasn't punishing. It was renewing itself. Like the phoenix that burns to be reborn, Baek had destroyed itself to be reborn stronger. Korea would also be reborn. It was a beautiful lie that some needed to believe. But in the villages, far from theological sophistication, the answers were more direct. Local shamans declared that ancestral spirits were hungry, not for food, but for blood. Human sacrifices, officially banned for centuries, returned to the shadows. How many died on makeshift altars? The records were destroyed, but modern archaeologists have found ritual markings dated precisely to 947. In Japan, the spiritual crisis was even deeper. The sun was not just a star. It was Materasu, the supreme goddess, the emperor's direct ancestor. If the sun was dying, the very divine essence of Japan was in question. Emperor Murakami accomplished the unthinkable and temporarily abdicated. For 100 days, the throne remained empty so that Amaterasu would not have to look upon an unworthy emperor. Shinto priests created new rituals. Sacred mirrors were obsessively polished to summon the sun back. Temple virgins danced until they fainted, trying to lure Materasu out of her cave of ash. A priest in IS wrote, "We have performed the rituals perfectly 1,000 times. Materasu does not respond. Either she has abandoned us, or we have forgotten how to speak to the gods." But it was in the steppes that the religious response was most radical. The shamans declared the end of an era. The old world had died with the sun. What emerged from the ashes would be completely new. Some clans abandoned their traditional gods completely. What gods would let all the horses die? They asked. New cults were born. The ash cult believed the volcano was a new god, more powerful than the old ones. They offered sacrifices to the ash itself. They ate ash mixed with blood. They painted themselves ash. The cult of the dead sun preached that darkness was the natural state, and light had been the aberration. They adapted to the eternal night, living in caves, avoiding all light. October 947, the big question. In every culture, the same question emerged. Were we punished or tested? The difference was crucial. Punishment meant they had erred and needed to atone. Testing meant they were chosen and needed to prove their worth. Buddhists tended toward punishment. The collective karma of violence and greed had created disaster. The solution was more compassion, more detachment. Monasteries multiplied. Men who lost everything became monks, not out of faith, but because they had nothing left to lose. The Confucianists saw a test. Heaven was verifying whether humanity deserved to continue. The solution was more order, more hierarchy, more ritual. If natural chaos had arrived, human order needed to compensate. The tastes had the most radical vision. Neither punishment nor test. It was just the like being the like. The mountain exploded because mountains explode. The sun disappeared because suns disappear. Fighting against this was like fighting against existence itself. The only answer was non-action. Acceptance flowing with the disaster like water flows with a river. But there was one religion that grew above all others, the cult of pragmatism. When the gods don't respond and rituals don't work, only one divinity remains: survival. Temples were dismantled to make bonfires. Sacred bronze statues were melted down to make tools. Sacred texts became fuel. One monk who survived wrote bitterly, "We discovered that Buddha does not warm in winter. Confucius does not feed children. Kamists do not melt ice. Only fire is real. Only food is sacred." December 947, the birth of the new order. When it became clear that the old world was over, they began to build the new kings who promised the sun would return if they proved worthy. Prophets who swore to see visions of the warm future. Messiahs who claimed to bring the light back. Many were charlatans. Some believed their own lies. But they all offered what the people desperately needed: hope that it would end, that there was a reason for the suffering, that someone somewhere had a plan. In the end, the gods didn't save anyone from the volcanic winter, but the need for gods for something, sense of purpose, of something greater than hunger and cold saved many from succumbing to final despair. And when the sun finally began to pierce the ashes, when the first ice arrived, when the first green harvest sprouted, each religion claimed the credit. The gods had returned, or they had never left, or they were new gods. Nobody agreed. But everyone agreed on one thing. They had passed the test. They had survived the end of the world. Now they needed to figure out how to live in the world that had risen from the ashes. And that world was unrecognizable, not just physically, although the scars on Earth were deep, but politically, socially, humanly. The volcano had done more than kill millions. He had rewritten the map of power in Asia. Let's start with China. The later Zhou dynasty, already moribund before the eruption, completely collapsed in 1947, but it was not a clean transition, it was a dismemberment. Local warlords who had controlled food distribution during the famine now controlled armies of desperate survivors. Lil Xuan, who would become later Han Emperor, did not gain power with cavalry and strategy. Conquered with rice. I had stockpiled grain before the eruption. Luckily, not pensions. When hunger came, he exchanged every bag of rice for absolute loyalty. Pledge allegiance or starve. Simple, effective, brutal. The new political map was drawn on empty stomachs. Regions that had been breadbaskets became political deserts. Mountainous regions, once marginalized, were now fortresses. They had clean water, hunting, isolation. The geography of power reversed. But the most profound change was philosophical. The ancient concept of heaven's mandate has been questioned like never before. If heaven could be so arbitrarily cruel, what legitimacy did it have? A cynical pragmatism was born. Rulers stopped justifying their power with philosophy. Now it was simple. I have food, don't you obey? In Goryeo, the kingdom survived but transformed. King Zhongzhong implemented radical reforms born of desperation. A mandatory corvée system. Every adult owed 60 days of work to the state per year, rebuilding. State granaries in each province by law are always kept full. Ban on grain exports under penalty of death. But the real revolution was silent. Buddhism, which preached detachment and acceptance of suffering, lost influence. People had seen too much real suffering to romanticize it. In its place, a militarized Confucianism grew. Order, hierarchy, preparation. Never again would they be caught off guard. In Japan, the changes were even more subtle and profound. The capital, Kyoto, survived, but royal power migrated. Provincial lords, who had protected their peasants during the famine, gained loyalty that the emperor would never regain. The seeds of the future feudal system were planted in 947, watered with blood and ash. A noble wrote, "The emperor claims descent from the sun, but when the sun died, who fed us? Lord Minamoto? Who protected us? Lord Taira!" The sun may have returned, but our loyalty did not. In the steppes, the nomadic world was completely reorganized. Entire clans had disappeared. Others, who by luck or wisdom had migrated earlier, now controlled vast empty territories. The old tribal alliances, based on kinship and tradition, were replaced by pragmatic confederations. Do you have horses? I have weapons. We will survive together or die apart. These new confederations were different, more militarized, more expansionist. Within 2 generations, descendants of these survivors would be knocking on Beijing's gates. The Mongols, who would conquer the world in the 11th century, were great-grandchildren of those who survived 947. The economy was reinvented from scratch. The old system of copper and silver currency collapsed. Metal didn't eat. A barter economy emerged, a system of future harvest credits, essentially medieval agricultural futures. If you feed me today, you receive 10% of my harvest for 3 years. If I die, my children will honor the debt. Millennial trade routes were abandoned, and others were created. The Northern Silk Road, which passed near the Paektu, never fully recovered. Maritime ancient and secondary routes became vital. Port cities that survived famine because of fishing grew exponentially, but it was in agriculture that the revolution was most profound. Techniques that worked 1 year ago were abandoned. In its place, mandatory diversification. Never depend on a single crop again. If rice failed, there was millet. If millet failed, there was buckwheat. If all else failed, there were tubers that survived under the snow. Development of cold-resistant varieties. Farmers who luckily had seeds that survived the volcanic winter became rich. These seeds were sold for absurd prices, kept like treasures, passed down as heirlooms, primitive greenhouses, wooden structures, and oiled paper that captured any available heat. They weren't efficient, but in a world where efficiency meant death better than nothing, they saved lives. Food preservation has become the science of war. Fermentation, drying, and salting techniques were perfected. Korean quinti, Japanese miso, Chinese sauerkraut all have roots in the post-947 period, when preserving food was preserving life. Socially, trauma created permanent changes. Cannibalism, even after the famine ended, left deep psychological scars. Entire villages changed their names to escape the shame. Families created fake genealogies. "We weren't here in 1947" has become a common refrain. A cultural harshness was born, infanticide in difficult times. It went from taboo to accepted practice. Better to die at birth than to die of hunger. At 5, old men developed the tradition last winter, when they felt it was too much of a burden. They walked into the snow and didn't come back. The arts have changed. Lyrical poetry about cherry blossoms was replaced by epics about survival. Paintings of serene landscapes gave way to depictions of the returning sun. The music became more melancholy in minor keys, with drums that imitated the sound of the earth shaking. In medicine, the disaster accelerated knowledge. Doctors have systematically documented the effects of extreme hunger. They discovered that certain herbs helped with the digestion of unusual foods, what type of malnutrition caused which disease, how to treat severe frostbite. Knowledge paid in suffering, but vital knowledge. Demography has been revolutionized. With so many dead, there was no shortage of earth, but there was a lack of people to work it. For the first time in centuries, workers had bargaining power. Salaries tripled. Serfs bought their freedom. The feudal structure, paradoxically, was both strengthened and weakened. And then in the summer of 948, the miracle happened. The first real harvest in 3 years was not plentiful. The soil was still recovering. The weather was still unstable, but it was enough. Rice grew, wheat ripened, millet rippled golden under a sun that finally felt like sunshine. A peasant in Renan left the most touching record. "My son, born in the black winter, saw green growing for the first time. He asked what magic that was. I said, 'It's not magic, son. It's just life coming back like it always does.' But he was wrong. Life had returned, yes, but not as usual. The world born from the ashes of Paektu was tougher, more pragmatic, more prepared, and would forever carry the memory of when the sun died and 30 million people died with it. But here's the detail that should terrify us all. Asia did not die alone. The whole world suffocated together, and we have the evidence written in ice, in trees, and on parchments that no one connected until the 20th century. Constantinople 947. A Byzantine scribe noted something peculiar. Summer hasn't arrived this year. The grapes did not ripen. The wheat grew stunted. Astrologers blame an invisible comet. It wasn't a comet, it was volcanic ash, 8,000 kilometers away, floating in the stratosphere, blocking the sun over the Bosphorus. The Byzantines did not know that a volcano had exploded in Asia. How would they know? There were no telegraphs, no internet, no CNN, but they recorded the symptoms. Brutal winters, failed harvests, famine in the provinces, revolts in Anatolia. The Byzantine Empire, already under pressure from the Arabs to the south, almost collapsed because of a volcano that they didn't even know existed. Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. Muslim chroniclers were obsessed with astronomy, recording everything. In 947 they wrote, "The stars are visible during the day through a veil. Allah covered the sun with his hand." Poetic but scientifically accurate. The volcanic ash was creating an atmospheric filter that allowed us to see Venus at midday. But most fascinatingly, the Arabs recorded snow in the Arabian desert. Snow in the desert in July. Bedouins who had never seen ice woke up to tents covered in white. Camels died from hypothermia. Oases froze. The impossible had become routine. Now let's go to where modern science has found the most dramatic evidence. Greenland in 1992. Scientists drilling into ancient ice found something extraordinary. A layer of volcanic sulfates dated precisely to 946-947. But here's the shocking thing. The concentration was greater than that of Krakatoa, Vesuvio, and Pinatubo. The Paektu had been one of the 5 biggest volcanic events of the last 2,000 years, and no one outside of Asia knew it. Ice doesn't lie. Each layer is a year like tree rings, and the 946-947 layer is black, literally black with gray. 2.5 years of chemical winter, preserved in frozen crystal. The sulfur isotopes perfectly match Paektu's chemical signature, but Greenland is 8,000 to 1,000 kilometers from the volcano. How the ash got there? Jet streams. These rivers of air 10 kilometers high that circle the planet. Paektu released material directly into these currents. In 3 weeks, the ash had circled the world. Within 6 weeks, it formed a uniform veil over the entire northern hemisphere. The first nuclear winter in documented history. Contambria tree rings. 2,000-year-old pine trees in Siberia show microscopic rings in 946-948. They have almost stopped growing. Oak trees in Germany, 5,000 kilometers from the volcano, show extreme stress. Beaches in California across the Pacific have recorded the coldest summers in 1,000 years. But why was this global catastrophe forgotten in the West? Simple, wrong attribution. Each culture blamed its own demons. Christians saw divine punishment. Muslims seen test of faith. Vikings blamed the Fimbul winter, the winter before the Ragnarok. No one imagined that the cause was a mountain exploding on the other side of the world. And there was the problem of time scale. The Black Death killed quickly, dramatically, visibly. The volcanic winter killed slowly, silently, confusingly. People died of hunger, of cold, of opportunistic diseases. There were no buboes to identify, no rats to blame. Just a cold that didn't end and crops that didn't grow. The Mayan records, incredibly, also show anomalies. Obsessive skywatchers noticed that the sun lost strength in their astronomical calculations of 947. They imagined that their gods were fighting. They were partially right. There was a fight going on between sunlight and billions of tons of volcanic aerosols. In sub-Saharan Africa, oral traditions tell of years when the sun became sick. Impossible to date precisely, but the description matches. Always cloudy skies, common cold, poor harvests. The bike may have contributed to migrations and political changes that historians have not yet connected. Even in Australia, the other side of the world, there is indirect evidence. Lake sediments show drastic changes in vegetation around 950. Heat-demanding eucalyptus trees were replaced by cold climate species. Then a pulse of cold inexplicable until now returned. The detective work that revealed all of this is fascinating. Japanese volcanologists were the first to suspect the real magnitude. In the 1960s, they found deposits of Paektu ash in Japan 1m deep. Doing the math, if it was 1,000 kilometer away, how much material was ejected in total? The answer, 100 to 150 kilometers C. For perspective, Mount St. Helens in 1980 ejected 1 kilometer C. Bikes was 100 times bigger. It was a V7 event. It only happens once every 1,000 years on average. But the most disturbing discovery came in 2010. Chinese and North Korean scientists, in a rare collaboration, discovered that Paektu is not dead, it is sleeping. The magma chamber is filling up again. Small earthquakes have increased tenfold since 2002. The mountain is 2 centimeters higher than in 1999, which leads us to the inevitable question. What if it happened today with our industrialized agriculture? Dependent on climate precision. With 8 billion mouths to feed, not 300 million. With supply chains that fail if a ship runs aground in Switzerland. With nuclear weapons in countries that would panic. With mass starvation, the volcano that the world forgot is still there waiting, and it is not the only one. There are 6 other potential V7s active now. Yellowstone, Camp Flegrei, Toba, Talpo, Aira, Long Valley. Anyone could replicate 946. But now the world is infinitely more interconnected, more populated, more fragile. In 946, isolated communities survived because they were self-sufficient. Today, no city has enough food to last more than 3 days. Paektu taught us that the planet can turn off the sun whenever it wants. We have forgotten the lesson, but the planet has not forgotten how to do it. And here we are, 2025, with our smartphones, GPS, delivery in 30 minutes, thinking that we dominate nature because we have air conditioning and hydroponic greenhouses. But answer me, if Yellowstone exploded tomorrow and it is 40,001 years late for its next eruption, how long would you last? It's not a rhetorical question. Really think your city has food for 3 days, maybe 5 if there is rationing. The trucks that supply supermarkets depend on fuel, which comes from refineries, which depend on electricity, which depends on plants that stop working when volcanic ash clogs everything. Within a week, the shelves would be empty. In 2, people would be doing things that seem unthinkable today. In 946 at least, they knew how to cultivate, hunt, and identify edible roots. Do you know? Your children know the difference between a poisonous plant and a nutritious one. Do you know how to make a fire without matches? Purify water without a filter? Preserving food without a refrigerator? I'm not being an alarmist, I'm being a mathematician. There are 20 active supervolcanoes on the planet. Now 6 of them show signs of restlessness. Camp Flegrei in Italy had 1,000 earthquakes last month. Yellowstone has risen 10 inches in the last decade. Paektu himself, the protagonist of our story, is waking up, and when the next V7 happens, he won't announce it on Twitter. It will be like 946. A few tremors, some animals running away, and then the world ends for 2 years. The difference is that in 946 there were 300 million people on the planet. Today we are 8 billion. They lost 30 million. Proportionally we would lose 800 million. 800 million. But here's the final plot twist. We could be prepared. We have the science. We know exactly what would happen. We could stockpile food, develop mass indoor agriculture, create energy systems that survive volcanic ash. We could, but we don't. Because it's easier to believe that the impossible will remain impossible, that the sun will always rise clean, that the supermarket will always have food, that 946 was a historical aberration, not a reminder. The survivors of 946 recorded their history in bones and ashes for us to learn. We discovered your message, decoded your warning, and chose to ignore. Do you know what impresses me most about this whole story? It's not the scale of the destruction. It's that you've come this far, 40 minutes of hearing about cannibalism, infanticide, 30 million dead, and you're still here. That says something about you. You're not the type to look away from difficult truths. He's the type who wants to understand even if it hurts. And if you're that kind of person, I need you to do me a favor, not for me, for the story you just heard. Share this video with that friend of yours who loves theories about the end of the world. Do you know which one? The one who sends messages at dawn talking about preparation, survival, and what if this or that happened? Send it to him now with a simple message, 946. It really happened, because the more people know about the year the sun died, the better chance we have of being prepared when it doesn't happen again. Comment your honest answer below. How many days would you survive if the sun disappeared tomorrow? Be brutal with yourself. 3 days, a week, a month, and most importantly, what would you do when the food ran out? It's not worth a generic answer. I want real strategy. I will pin the most honest and disturbing comments, because people need to see, they need to think, they need to prepare. And look, if you haven't signed up yet, now is the time. Every week I bring stories that school books prefer to hide. Last week it was about the Black Death doctors signing death contracts. Next week, see this video appearing on the screen. It's about the year without a summer of 1816, when the other volcano, Tambora, killed summer in Europe and America. Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein during that dark summer. 100,000 people died, and the worst was just a V6, a point smaller than the Bike D. Click on it now, but before you sign up, activate the bell. Not because I need to, I already have too many people watching me and losing sleep, but because you need these stories. You need to know what has already happened to understand what could happen. With each video you watch here, you become a little less naive about how the world really works or how it stops working. Share it in your stories. You don't need to write anything, just share it with a question. What if it were today? Makes people curious. Let them discover that the end of the world has happened before several times. Because that's what we do here. We don't tell stories to entertain. We tell them to warn. The past screams its lessons, but most people are too busy on TikTok to listen. You heard it now. You know that a volcano can turn off the sun for years. You know 30 million died. You know that people ate indispensable things to survive, and you know that it could happen again at any moment. Sleep well with this information. See you next week if we get there. M.